Keep rowing! What are you doing? Did anybody just see that? Over there!
I don't see anything!
What are we looking for? Go! It's a what? Go! Let's go!
It can't be.
We have to get out of here! Everyone go! Go! Faster! Let's go! Nobody move!
Simon, what?
I said everybody stop! Stop!
Okay, stop.
Nobody move!
That's not a ghost!
Are you crazy?
Don't be afraid! It's me!
Jesus?
Impossible.
How is this the second most incredible thing I've seen today?
This surprises you? Did you learn nothing from today?
If it is you, command me to come to you on the water.
Simon, no!
Are you out of your mind?
If you are who you say you are, bid me to step out of this boat.
From this third season of the TV show The Chosen. It comes right out of Matthew chapter 14. And what Peter says there, I think, is really profound. Peter says to Jesus, if you are who you say that you are, if you are who you claim to be, then do something. Have you been there in faith before? I think a lot of us have. Like, God, if you are who you say you are, if you are who you claim to be, if you are what the scriptures say, then God, why won't you do something? You realize in that moment, the disciples, the only reason that they were in that boat, you can look it up, Matthew chapter 14. The only reason they were in that boat was because Jesus told them to be there. They were in a place and Jesus said, no, we're going to get in the, you need to get in the boat and we're going to go to the other side. And I will meet up with you there. And so the disciples are there in the middle of a storm and he's not. And so they're like, Peter says, if you are who you say you are, if you are good, then do something. I think for a lot of us in faith, a lot of times we found ourselves in a place where we feel adrift. And we've prayed all the prayers, we've done all the things, we've tried to do what it is that we could do, and it feels as if we're hearing nothing. And we don't know what to say, and we don't know what to do, and we don't know where to turn. I remember when I was a fifth grader, one of my best friends, his name was Chris, and Chris, my family was a lake family. We had a lake cabin, so we'd go there every weekend. And Chris was my best friend, and I always wanted him to come to the lake with us. But Chris's family, they weren't a lake family. So the answer was no, because they thought if they let Chris go to the lake, like who knows what could happen? They could fall into the water, he could drown, somehow he'd get hurt. And then finally one time, fifth grade, I said, Chris, can you come to the lake with us this week? And he said, yeah, absolutely we can. And I'll never forget going to pick Chris up. We went to his house. Chris came out, his mom was with him. He had his duffel bag, and Carolyn, his mom, was out there. And I'll never forget what she said. She said, now promise me that you guys won't do anything that's dumb. And I'm like, of course, we'd never do anything that was dumb. So we'd never go to the water without our life jackets on. We'd never be unsupervised by my parents. And the minute we get to the lake, we got out of the car, and I'm like, hey, man, you got to come down to the water because we have this little fishing boat. And my parents let me drive the fishing boat all by myself. And Chris said, do you think that's safe? And I said, absolutely, it's safe. And so he said, oh, okay. So we get in the boat, and we start to go, and it's like a 6-horse Evinrude motor. And so I'm going like max speed of like 3.5 miles an hour, and I'm just cruising. And we're going straight out, getting as far away as we can because there's a sense of freedom. And so I was on one of those hand throttles, and so all I can see is what's in front of me. But Chris is in the bench in the front of the boat, and all he can see is what's behind us. And what Chris starts to notice is that the sky has gotten incredibly dark. And there's a little bit of a light show that's going on. And at first it starts with like kind of some flashes of light in the distance, and Chris is like, hey, Jeremy, do you think we should go back yet now? And I said, no, it'll be fine. And then it goes from little flashes of light to bolts of light. And Chris was like, Jeremy, we need to go back. And so I start to turn the boat around, and then I realized that I forgot to check something before we left. And that was how much gas that we had. So I kid you not, as soon as I start to turn the boat around to start gunning it towards home so we can kind of beat this storm, the thing dies. And so I'm sitting there, I'm pulling the ripcord, trying to get this thing going, and nothing's happening. And Chris is like, what are we going to do? So I have no clue. And he said, do you have oars? And I said, yeah, we have oars. They're at the cabin. Like, I didn't bring them. And we're like in this place where first, I realized that Chris is never going to be able to come to the lake cabin with me again. More importantly, I didn't know how we were going to get out of it. We've been there. I know some of us are there right now. I was telling Jamie just at the beginning of the service, I was texting back and forth with a family. It's one of two families I know of right now that's losing a loved one. And it's in that moment we feel incredibly adrift, and sometimes it's in those moments where faith becomes the hardest, doesn't it? Psalm 13. Psalmist says, How long, O Lord, will you forget me? Forever? How long will you look the other way? If you are who you say you are, then do something. Act on it. And this is why what Paul's saying to the church in Philippi is so important. We're in the middle of this message series called God's Electric Power Company. So we're going to go through Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians. And now we've done the first two, and now we're in Paul's letter to the church in Philippi. And what Paul's saying is a truth that allows us to find joy and peace in a world that can feel adrift, in lives that can feel adrift. But in order to do that, we need to understand the context to which Paul's writing. Because it can be really easy to say, well, yeah, it's easy for him. I mean, he writes 2/3 of the New Testament. His life isn't like he doesn't know what difficult times are like. He doesn't know what life is like. But this context that we'll understand, well, it makes it all the more powerful.
So as we take a look at the context, the audience that Paul is writing this letter to, and also where Paul is writing from, so much about this letter will make even more sense. So Paul is writing to this church in Philippi, and you can see here an artist's rendering of this ancient city, of ancient Philippi. Philippi is strategically placed. You can kind of see it's up against some foothills and has some farmland around it and a wall. It's a smaller city. It's strategically placed in a unique part of southern Europe. So where Philippi is now is it's under modern day Bulgaria. And both then, in Paul's time, and now, that's considered Europe. And so this is the first European church. You can read all about Paul's missionary journeys in the book of Acts. You can read about his first time in this city, his second time in this city. And the audience that he's writing to after he starts this church is a really unique blend for this time. Because of the farmland and what's happening in this city, there's a lot of farmers and peasants, people who are Gentiles that are in this area and in this city. But also because Alexander the Great's father, Philip, had conquered this city and area and named the city of Philippi after himself, Philip, this city also became the place where Roman military and soldiers would go after they retired, or when they retired. And so this city is also filled with veterans. So when we take a look at some of Paul's verses that he's writing about in this letter, this context in the audience starts to make a lot more sense. One other person worth noting here that Paul met in this area is Lydia. You can read about the story of Paul meeting Lydia, this woman, near the city in the vicinity of Philippi, and she's the first convert to Christianity that happens in Paul's missionary journeys. And so it's often thought that Paul built this church in Philippi on Lydia. And so this is a stained glass window that's in the church of Lydia, that's on supposedly the place where Paul and Lydia met. And you can go. It's a baptistry. You can go and be baptized there if you want. And so as we take a look at the where and the who of Paul's letters, some things begin to make a little bit more sense. So as you'll see on the next slide here, there are several famous verses from this one letter. It's just a 4-chapter letter, but this letter's greatest hits include, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain," as Paul writes in Philippians 1:21. There's this beautiful song or poem that Paul quotes in Philippians chapter 2, where he's talking about Jesus. Although Jesus was God, he didn't consider equality with God as something to be grasped, but he instead humbled himself, taking on the nature of a human and served. So there's this beautiful poem that begins to make a little bit more sense when you know the military aspect of who Paul is writing to. And then also, of course, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. One of the most famous verses in all of Scripture. And that one verse alone will sound a lot different by the end of what we talk about today. And you'll be able to see how our understanding of this context shapes our understanding of what Paul is writing about. The other most important piece of context, hands down, that you and I and all of us need to know is where Paul is writing from. He's not writing from vacation or the beach. He's not writing from an academic institution or a castle or a high tower. Paul is writing from prison. He's behind bars because he was preaching the good news of Jesus Christ, and it got him into trouble. And the things that Paul writes about from behind bars is not a lot of woe is me, this is really difficult. He acknowledges that there are hardships, but he wildly talks about joy. He talks about peace. He addresses worry. And once we know where Paul is, these verses, especially where Paul talks about joy, start to make a lot more sense.
It's in Philippians chapter 4. Where Paul says, always be full of joy in the Lord. I'll say it again, rejoice. Some of you have remembered it as rejoice in the Lord always. I'll say it again, rejoice in other translations. And when we know that Paul is saying this from a prison cell, that he doesn't know whether or not he's going to ever gain physical freedom from, we start to wonder, how on earth is that possible? How could somebody who's in prison, somebody who's being punished for the thing that he's proclaiming, like, how does that all make sense? And I think one of the reasons that we have such a difficult time with that is we don't know the difference between joy and happiness. We don't understand that there is a difference. If you can go back to the last slide, please, that would be great. We don't understand that there is a difference. When I was in college, I was an English major, and one of the classes I took was development of the English language. And one of the things that's so fascinating about English as a language, and some of you who aren't native English speakers, you know this, that one of the difficulties about English is that it's a language that has been pieced together by so many different languages, by so many different influences. We have Latin influences, we have Latin roots of words, we have Old English roots of words. We have French roots of words. So we have all of these things that start to come in and to form the language and the words that we use today. And sometimes the true meaning of what a word says, it becomes lost on us, as it is with happiness and joy. If we're going to go look at what happiness actually means, the word happiness, if you want to go to the next slide, it actually means, it's from the Old English word hap. And what it means is chance, fortune, or luck. And it's completely dependent on momentary and external circumstances. It's being in a state of chance, in a state of good fortune, in a state of luck. Now, I'm a huge Minnesota Twins fan. That's my favorite team. It's the team that, if you told me you can watch one team, one game right now, I would pick a Twins game. That's just my favorite thing. I watched them this afternoon. They won. I watched them this afternoon. Love it. And I was there Game 7 of the 1987 World Series when they won their first World Series title. It was amazing. 4 years after that, 1991, they won another World Series. And ever since then, it's been crickets. It's been awful. We're 0 for our last 18 playoff games. In my entire lifetime, the average winning percentage of my team is just under 50%. We lose more than we win. And so I'm watching games every single day, and my wife wishes that I wouldn't. Because last night they were playing and they were getting killed. And I was like, I hate this team. I hate this team. I'm never going to watch this team again. And she's like, please don't. And then this afternoon, I'm like, can you believe it? Their pitcher had a perfect game going into the 7th inning. I'm like, this is the best. This is the best. And she said, just go back to church, please. Because my happiness in those moments is based on fortune or luck or things that are temporary. And a lot of us do that. It's natural. A lot of us do that with the teams that we follow. Or we do it with the job that we hold or the relationships that we have. And when those things don't go the way that we want them to, then there goes our happiness. Joy's different, entirely different. Joy comes from the Greek word kara, which that literally means a deep inner untouchable gladness, which is independent of external circumstance. Kara is the same root that we use to get the word charis in Greek, which means grace. That joy is something that's born out of the realization of God's grace for us. That nothing in this world can take away from us. Paul told that to the church in Rome. Romans chapter 8, that nothing in all of creation could ever separate you from God's love. And knowing that gives you joy despite your circumstance. 7 years ago, I had the opportunity to go to Haiti. People say that if there's third world countries, Haiti's a fourth world country. Poverty is extreme. As a church, we had done this project that we were doing cement floors in the homes that were there that would help prevent disease and things that would come through the earth of their homes. And Tim, the executive director of the organization that we went there with, he and I were going from house to house. We were able to pray for some people, and there was this woman. I'll never forget her. In our standards in the United States, we wouldn't consider her to be very old. She was probably in her early 70s, but in that area of the world, that was like end of life years because they don't have medicine the way that we do. And I remember looking at her, and I'd be surprised if she weighed 80 pounds. Her husband had died. Her kids had moved away. There's no social service. There was nothing for her. I remember praying praying and blessing the house that had gotten the cement floor. And then I remember hugging her and asking her, is there anything that I could pray for you? And her response was so surprising to me. She said, "Oh, sweetheart, I have everything that I need. Save your prayers for those who don't." The outside looking in, we would have thought that this person had nothing. But she had joy because she knew who her Savior is. We see situations like this playing out as we watch, and we see the things that are happening in Maui as people's lives are being devastated, and there's these stories of faith that are popping up where people are saying things that just don't seem to line up with the experiences that they're having. There's a pastor of a church, and he lost family members of his. 3 or 4 of his family members passed away. His church building was destroyed. The whole community, all the homes in his community were destroyed. And there was an interview where he was being interviewed, and they asked him, "What are you going to do? Where are you going to turn? How do you get through this?" I mean, again, because if we look through eyes without the promises of Jesus, we would say that that's the end of the road for him, for his church, for his community. But he responds very powerfully. If Peter can walk on water, so can we. I can't tell you how, and I can't tell you when, but somehow we're going to get back to the shore. This is what Paul is saying from the floor of the prison that he's in. He's saying, always be full of joy in the Lord. This isn't some pie in the sky. This isn't some wish. This is based on the reality of the promises of the God who saved him. Paul, on the way to Damascus, had his life turned absolutely around by the risen Jesus, who comes to him and says, "Paul, turn around. I have a promise for you. I have a life for you." Paul's writing something that is so near and dear to his heart that nothing in this world can take away from him, and it can't take it away from you either. It's Nehemiah, if we go back to the Old Testament. Nehemiah was somebody that God called to rebuild the walls of the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem had been leveled, and so they're going back and they're going to rebuild their lives. And as they were rebuilding the walls of this town, somebody came across a copy of God's law, God's gift for people to guide their relationships with one another. And so they started to read through God's law, and they started to recognize how far they had fallen from God's design for their lives. And so people started to weep and they started to cry because they felt as if their lives were hopeless. And Nehemiah says, don't be dejected and sad, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. The joy of the Lord is your strength. The joy of the Lord, the promises of God, the things that God gives us that nothing can take away. And it's so important to know that. And it's so important to be reminded of that, because there are so many things in life that try to take it away from us. Sometimes the way we fixate on the circumstances that consume us.
So when Paul is talking about joy and worry, he knows that there's a connection between the two of them, that worry and joy are not opposites, but so often they can coexist together. And what Paul wants to do is communicate in this letter about our perspective on worry, our perspective on how we avoid getting caught in the trap of looping and spinning and worrying and spending all of our time thinking about these things that are our carries and our woes and the situations that concern us. And so here's the thing about when you and I worry as human beings who have existed on this earth. Worry is not just something that's now. Paul knows that the people he is talking to worry as well. The thing about worry is that when we're spinning on this situation and thinking about this thing, vexing about it, whatever, those things all matter to us. We don't worry about things that we don't care about, whether it's a person or a situation. There's some care or concern. But when we find ourselves spinning like a top and whirling on this thing that we're caring about so deeply, Paul wants to remind all of us that there's something more. There's a better way. And so the word that Paul uses when he's talking about worry is merimnao. It's a verb, to worry, and the noun is merimna. They're very similar. And so these words mean to be drawn in different directions, to be divided as a simultaneous state, to go to pieces through being pulled apart or distracted. And it's actually kind of crazy how this word for worry is kind of like the experience of being on this death contraption. I mean, merry-go-round. This was one of my all-time favorite things to do when I was at the park and at the playground with my friends when I was a kid. And I was the nutso one who didn't like to just live in the center or the first level or layer of handholds, but I like to be way out here on the edge. I just loved that feeling of just flying. And often I was actually known to lay down and stick my head over the edge and avoid decapitation at the same time, and to just yell faster as people are making this merry-go-round go faster and faster and faster. But if you've been on a merry-go-round and if you've been on that outside edge for a while, you know that experience of being fun quickly turns into something else. You start to feel sick to your stomach, like maybe you got to go take care of some weird pukey business somewhere else, you know? And so this experience of being out here on the edge isn't fun anymore. And that's what worry is like. It can be nice to spin around something and really digest a situation a couple turns around, but if we're not careful, so often that can really quickly turn into something that doesn't physically make us ill, or maybe it does physically make us ill, but we just spin. And that is not what God has for us. When Paul is talking about this, do not worry, he doesn't just use words that are a suggestion or a question. He uses a Greek tense called the imperative. It's a command. He says, do not worry. And Paul is echoing the words of Jesus in the New Testament and the places where Jesus says, do not worry. Jesus also uses this command tense in Greek. Do not worry. And the thing that can be so slippery about worry is it reminds me of a story from when I was doing youth ministry. I was doing youth ministry in Seattle after I graduated. I grew up here in Iowa, moved out to Seattle, was doing student ministry with a friend's dad. We had a great time, and one summer we took students to the beach on a beach retreat. And long story short, there were rip currents that day. And if you know what a rip current is, it's a really quickly moving bit of water that can go anywhere from 1 to 2 to 8 feet per second. And one of our students got pulled out into the water on a rip current. It was a really awful situation. The emergency vehicles were called. Some people started charging out into the water to save him. But the difficult thing about going out into the water to save someone else caught in a rip current is that you might also be caught in a rip current as well. And so the thing that this student had done is he'd just kind of gone out to the point where you can feel like you have control standing on a firm foundation and you're not going to get swept off your feet by these waves. And then he'd gone a little bit farther, and then he'd gone a little bit farther. This was kind of par for the course for him. And then he'd gone a little bit farther and found himself in a really precarious situation. The story ended well. He was saved. He made it back to shore, and we were all so grateful because the only thing that we could do while we were waiting for emergency vehicles and watching his head bobbing out there was to pray. God, please, please help. And the thing about worry and getting caught in the undertow is that there's this point at which our concern when we're thinking about a situation can sometimes begin to flirt with worry. And then sometimes our worries just take us out to sea. Maybe we see or hear about a situation that really causes a lot of worry. We see a headline or something on social media, and if we're not careful, we just begin to spin. I love the way that Joyce Meyer talks about worry and being caught in this undertow. She said, worry is a down payment on a problem that you may never have. We may never experience the things that we worry about. And what a waste of our God-given time and energy, mental and emotional energy. And that is what Paul is saying when he talks about these verses about don't worry. Because Paul, from prison, has this incredible perspective that was good for the church in Philippi, and it's good for us still today. That worry emphasizes the problem, whereas prayer emphasizes not only the solution, but the God who saves, the God who solves. When the disciples were in that boat, they had no idea that the one who was coming to save them could save them in such a miraculous way. You and I worship a God who knows solutions far beyond what we might be able to come up with on our own. And that is why Paul writes in the NLT translation, as you'll see on the next slide, these verses. Do not worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. Tell God what you need. Thank him for all he's done. This is the shift of perspective that Paul is inviting us into. And I love the way that Eugene Peterson translates this same verse into the Message. He says, don't fret or worry. Instead of worrying, pray. Let petitions and praises shape your worries into prayers, letting God know your concerns. Before you know it, a sense of God's wholeness, everything coming together for good, will come and settle you down. It's wonderful what happens when Christ displaces worry at the center of your life. Because it's really kind of fun to be out here on the edge, but after a couple times around the merry-go-round, or after we're able to shift our perspective, the best place to be is in the center. You're still on the merry-go-round, the whole situation is still happening, but it's a place of steadiness, of way less being whipped around, being made way less sick. And so this is what Paul wants the church in Philippi to understand about joy and worry and experiencing God's peace that comes to us. Jeremy, will you tell us about God's peace and how it comes to us?
It's in that story of the disciples in the boat where Jesus approaches and he says, don't be afraid. Take courage, because I am here. You know, in the moment, they were super puzzled by it because they couldn't imagine that somehow he had gotten to them in their current state. And I think I feel the same way sometimes. That where I am or what I'm feeling or all the things that are going on, how could God ever make it to where I am in that moment? but he does. We sang about it just a minute ago. He won't fail. He will not fail. Paul didn't physically know how the story was going to end for him, but eternally, he had no question about it. Because he knew that Jesus had come for him individually, uniquely. This is what gives Paul the ability to say in the next part of this incredible passage in Philippians chapter 4, he says, then when you understand that there's a God who has come for you, who's given his life for you. I mean, you heard Jamie talk about it in the greatest hits of the letter to the Philippian church. Though he was God, he didn't consider equality with God was something to hold on to, but he emptied himself in such a way that he poured out his divine privileges and he took on the form of a human being and gave his life and surrendered his life on the cross. Paul says when we understand that and we can open our hearts and receive that, then we'll start to experience peace. A peace that exceeds anything that we could ever understand. That guards our hearts and our minds and what changes our lives. We got to be reminded that we know how this story ends. There are twists and there are turns around the way, but we know that there is a God who has come through the power of his Holy Spirit. Even though the circumstances, we would love them to be entirely different, we still can have joy. We still can experience peace. Too often we think that peace is the absence of any kind of chaos. When is that possible? I mean, turn on the news for a minute and you're reminded of it, aren't you? No, the peace that is going to guard our hearts and our minds. It's a peace that comes in the middle of the storm. It doesn't mean that the storm immediately goes away. It just reminds us that there's somebody who's come for us in the middle of the storm. This is the power that the disciples realized that Peter experienced when Jesus came for him. And it changed everything. Not just Peter's life, but everybody in that boat's life. And also our lives are changed by what Jesus did. Take a look.
Why are you chasing after Gentiles when your own people have problems right here? When your own person has problems? I've been right here in front of you, believing in you, but you're breaking up fights in the Decapolis?
Then come to me. You, weary and heavy laden, I will give you rest.
Simon, no.
Don't be foolish, Simon!
Simon!
Wait! Simon!
No! Simon!
Simon! Simon, where are you going?
What are you doing, Simon?
Simon!
Do you still have faith?
Faith hasn't been my problem. I gave up everything to follow you. But you're healing total strangers!
Keep your eyes on me.
Lord, send me! I'm sinking!
Help me, please!
Don't let me go. Don't let me go. I got you. I got you. Don't let me go. I got you. Please. Oh, you of little faith. Why did you doubt? Don't let me go.
I love what Peter says in that clip, and I know that they're taking some editorial rights, but I think the sentiment is just spot on. That when he's been adrift and his Savior comes and grabs a hold of him, he says, don't ever let me go. I will never forget, and you know how the story ends on the boat in the lake with my friend Chris. I mean, I'm here. But I didn't know if I would be because it was really scary. And I had a 5th grade perspective. I remember Chris and I were there, and we literally were looking at each other. We were soaking wet at this point because it was raining so hard. I remember the water gathering on my feet. Like it was literally like one of those rains where it feels like it's an inch per second. I mean, it was raining so hard. And I was at that moment where literally like I'm either going to jump out of this boat or I'm going to start crying, and I don't know which one I'm going to do first. And then all of a sudden we heard a motor. And we saw this arm waving in the air, and it was like, hey, hey. And it was my dad, and he was in the big boat. He was in our ski boat. Now my dad is Captain Cautious. He's never driven more than like 12 miles an hour in his life in that boat. But that time, he was flying. He was flying because the ones that he loved were in trouble. So he comes over to us, and he kind of gets the boat to shore, and we get the boat to shore, and we pull it up, and I'm like, Dad, is it going to be safe? And he's like, who cares? Get in the boat. We're going home. And as we're going home, Chris is like, your dad's the best. And I'm like, yeah, most of the time. He's pretty cool. But he's like, he came in the middle of a storm. Like the lightning could have hit him just as much as it could have hit us, but you got to realize that there was someone that was in a boat that had gone adrift that needed to be saving, and there was nothing that was going to keep him away from the ones who had no hope. This is the message of Jesus Christ. This is what Paul wants us to know. This is what God did on the cross. This is what changes the perspective of those disciples that are in that boat, because it wasn't just that the storm would go away, because they knew at some point the storm would come back again. That's not the message of Jesus Christ. That somehow you accept him, you read your faith statement, and then you'll never have a storm again. No, it's who's going to be with you in the middle of those storms. The disciples saw in Matthew chapter 14, they saw what happened when Jesus came, and they realized that he was more than just some person that they were going to blindly follow. That he truly was the one who was who he said that he was, who had the power to save. And in that, even though the storm was raging on, they could have peace. N.T. Wright puts it this way. He says, the peace of God will be with you, not because of what you do, not because of how hard you try, not because of like some spiritual resume. The peace of God will be with you because the God of peace is with you. That's what gives Paul the ability to have this incredible closing to this segment in Philippians chapter 4. Paul says, I have learned the secret of life. I have learned how to live life if I have a lot or if I have a little. Because it really doesn't matter in the end if I have Jesus. I know the secret of living life with my stomach being full or if my stomach is empty, because it really doesn't matter as long as I have Jesus. I know how to live life if I am behind the bars of a prison or if I am free, because ultimate freedom in life comes from Jesus. Because Paul says I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. And I guess our question for you this evening is, where do you need God's strength? Where is that place that kind of feels like it's kind of gotten a little bit unraveled? And we're going to sing a song together tonight. It's going to be kind of this prayer that we're going to sing. It's a song actually that was written by Hope Worship. It's phenomenal. And we're going to sing it, and this is going to be our prayer. And anything that's on your heart and on your mind, a place where you feel like it's broken, where you're adrift, and I just want to invite you to give that to God and see what he does with it. As you allow him to be the center that keeps you rooted, and so you don't continue to spin, but that you can find peace. So let's stand and we'll sing, and then we'll go home. Let's worship.